Hey there, faculty friends. This is the presentation that I gave at Faculty Workday, and I'm just putting it together in an online format just in case anyone wants to refer to it. So this is going to be a little bit about the pandemic teaching this fall, and this first picture was just a fun remembrance of what it looked like just a couple years after the last pandemic ended in the 1920s when Louis Barry Chafer founded DTS. So students were obviously not social distancing or wearing masks, but we did a little survey of our students this spring, right after the spring ended and the summer was beginning, to ask them how they felt about the fall and how they felt we had done. And a big chunk of the students really felt like we had just done a great job, in large part because of how well you faculty responded and cared for our students. A lot of the students really appreciated things like the pass-fail option, even though only about a quarter of them took it. More than half of them really appreciated that. But at the same time, they struggled to feel engaged, they struggled to feel motivated. And most of them said that their professors communicated with them, or that they say were in an online class where the professors didn't need to communicate changes to them. So I think they're just appreciating you and wanting to hear from you. And so the more we can do to love them and show grace to them will be just great this fall. But as you're thinking about them, the other question we asked them was what they're struggling with. And of course, finances and jobs were the biggest thing. But you see more than a quarter of them have family or physical, and almost a third of them have mental health issues and really spiritual issues. So be keeping that in mind. I think we can still have a really solid semester as we think through and teach, but just know that they're hurting just like we are, and they're struggling. So when we think about the kinds of classes that we typically do here at DTS, we kind of have four models. And they range from classes that are what we would call synchronous or real-time, or where there's a lot of engagement, and then asynchronous, where there's not as much time where you're actually really directly interacting with them. And so on one end is our traditional classes that we have in classrooms where we meet every week. And the other side are what we'd call the asynchronous, our OL model, where we record the classes and the students watch pre-recorded videos, and usually you're interacting via text online. So at these two opposite ends of the spectrum, we also have some classes that kind of mix modes. So our hybrid classes, use those OL recorded videos, but they also have intensive periods of time where you get to be face-to-face and have more synchronicity with your students. And that can happen over multiple weekends or just one weekend. And then we have some classes where we intentionally use video conferencing, where we might have some pre-recorded material, but we also meet via Zoom or Webex every week. And those classes can be really, really rich, especially because they're planned that way. Well, as you all know, back in March, we kind of moved to this crisis teaching that was not really any of these four models exactly, because they all kind of moved to video conferencing, but because they weren't really planned that way, they were challenging. And even the summer ones, we had a little bit more planning, but it still wasn't really ideal in what we'd want to do. So this fall, we're going to have another kind of crisis teaching that introduces another wrinkle into that. And so when we think about just what we do as professors, we have these goals or these objectives in our syllabi of what we're trying to accomplish, the cognitive goals and the affective goals and skills or psychomotor goals that we learn, from educational theory. And then we have all these different things that we do. And some classes have more lecture, some have more discussion, some have more presentation. Some are reading and writing, but we're trying to translate all these things into all these different mediums that we've developed in different delivery methods. But this year we're being asked to do this additional crisis stuff. And so that means that if we're doing a normal class where we would be doing a hybrid, we're going to be doing something different, or a class where we had a regular classroom class in Dallas or Houston, that's going to be something different too. So we'll talk through some of the options for that. So first, I just want to address the outlier that not everybody does, which is the block hybrid classes, where we would normally just start online and then get to have this intensive session over a couple of days and then finish online. And one of the cool things that we've learned in the pandemic is that we can actually add video conferencing through the semester, and that can actually really enrich the class and make it be a lot stronger than it would have been if we just had pre-recorded video and face-to-face. Using the video conferencing is strong. But some of the classes we're not going to be able to transfer to or travel to, and so we're just going to make those be entirely video conference with a big section on that original weekend. But for our traditional classes, the thing that we're doing for kind of pandemic teaching is adding some remote learning options if somebody gets sick or needs to care for a loved one or their kids, or just doesn't feel comfortable coming to campus for whatever reason. So before Thanksgiving, we're all going to try to teach in person and be there and have as normal of a session as we can be with shields and masks and all that stuff. But we're also going to allow students to come in remotely through LifeSize. And I want to walk you through how to do that in a minute. And then after Thanksgiving, we're going to transition to laptop teaching and try to make it be as safe as possible for those final 2 weeks of instruction and finals week. And then that'll be different, where all the students are on the same level instead of some on screen and some in the class. So to make this all happen, the online ed team has been working really hard to go through every single campus class, not just online classes, but campus classes, and add a kind of a common getting starting block there where it has the syllabus that we normally have, but it also adds this video conferencing information where they're posting the links to make sure that students know how to get into the class if they want to join remotely. So you don't have to manage that part. They can just go there and find the link to LifeSize there. And then we're also asking you to go in and to record a video. So if you go into your class in Canvas, you can click on that welcome video, and there's a little button to record there that Canvas has that you can just record right from your laptop, press save, and you're done. And that way you can just introduce yourself, introduce the class, introduce some of the changes that will happen, and make the students kind of have a warm introduction when the classes go live on Sunday or Monday. So this part that we're going to do before Thanksgiving, when you walk into your class in Dallas or in Houston, there's going to be this LifeSize setup. It's going to feel a little bit different. So I want to walk you through kind of how to start that device up. And the device looks something like this. It's this little round device that'll be there in the front of the class, and there's a bunch of little buttons on it. And it seems kind of tricky, but it really, when you walk through it, there should be a sheet that looks something like this in your classroom, and it'll just walk you through what to do. So the first thing that you already do, this number 1, power up the projector. You just press the power on the remote, and it should already be on if there's been other classes throughout the day. But if you're the first one in there, you turn that on as step 1. And then on step 2, you're just going to call into your class. So there's a button there that says call. You click that one, the upper right one. And then there's a kind of a menu here that you're going to click to that says meetings. So you click that, and then you scroll through this list of all the sections, and you're going to click the little dial in as video button. Now, if you happen to have an SD class or a WM and it's down at the bottom, there is a little guide on the side on the right that has all the letters of the alphabet, so you can go through that list because there's something, like 300 classes in there, and it might take a little bit to find yours. So once you've dialed into the class, you're basically ready to go. But the next thing you could do is you could position the camera. So you can click on the camera and zoom in or out, and then you can plug in your laptop to the HDMI cable and then click present. And then you can show your slides. So I want to talk a little bit about presenting because it's going to be a little bit tricky depending on the kind of classroom that you have. So we have 2 basic setups. On the left is Campbell 201 and 202, which were designed for these RV sections where it's really usually a smaller set of students in the class and a few on screen, and it's really more for discussion. In this case, the professor is the purple person in the back of the room looking at the screen, and the screen is looking at them. And so you can both see your students and see the people on screen at the same time. Well, all these other classes this fall that have gotten added to, the trick is that the orange professor up front has to turn around and look behind him or her to be able to see the students who are on screen. So that's going to be the new tricky element, is that they're going to be back there. So if they have a question, you're not going to know right away. So I want to walk through some ways to do that. But first, I just want to show you again a class diagram of how this looks. These are our actual DTS classrooms, not the illustration. Again, 201 here on the top left is our normal RV class where we really designed it for this, where the professor is facing that red camera and the screen. But on the right side is Todd 215, just as an example, where the podium's up front and the professor is facing the camera, but the screen is behind him or her. And that's going to mean you can't see those students on screen. So you're going to have to turn around and look. So when you get in there, once you've made the call and you're getting to presenting, that little round button that says layouts, you're going to click on that, and it's going to come up with these 3 options. And I want to walk you through the difference between these 3. So there's 2 simple ones. One is just to show the slides. So there's just a slide behind the orange professor here. And then one is to show the people behind the orange professor, where you're just seeing those interacting, but you can't see your slides. And then there's one that combines those 2 views and makes your slides a little bit smaller. So when you're in one of these RV classes, if you're one of the ones that has an RV section, you designed it that way, then when you start out the class, you're almost always going to just do this mode where you show slides and people. And at that moment, when you're presenting, if you're going to do, say, a 15 or 20 minute lecture portion, then you might want to go to the Zoom and zoom in on just you, so you're the only one visible on the screen to the remote students. But then if you want to have a whole classroom discussion where the people on screen can see the students in the class, you might want to switch it back to the discussion mode, to sort of the people mode, where everybody in the classroom can see on screen just people but not slides. And then you might want to zoom out so that everybody can see. It's hard to remember to do all of this stuff. So you can usually just leave it in that double mode where you can see both, and that should work just fine for the students. But if you can remember to switch maybe once or twice in the class, that should help those students. But the vast majority of you are going to be in one of these presenter rooms. Well, this is in Todd or in Campbell, where the screen is behind you. And normally you would see something on your own screen, but you won't see the students there. So here's my recommendation for this, is that you start out the class by doing the people view, where you can see everybody who's remote will be up on the screen, and you won't be able to see your slides yet. Start out in that mode. But then once you start saying, okay, guys, we're going to start, we've prayed, I'm going to do a lecture. In that lecture moment, instead of doing the view where you can see the slides and people, the catch is if you do that, the students in the room will be able to see those remote students on screen, and those people could kind of be distracting to them if they're drinking or eating or something like that. So instead of doing that, just switch it to the presentation mode. That's going to mean you can't see the remote students, but if you are just going through some slides, kind of pounding through some material for 10 or 15 minutes or showing Logos or something like that, it's going to be best just to do that. And then when you're kind of ready for a pause, you can switch it back to the people mode. And in that mode, you'll be able to actually interact a little bit more with the people and then go back to your lecture later on. So this can be a little hard to remember, again, to do all this stuff. So your first week, don't worry about doing too much of it. Come back to this as you develop it throughout the semester. Now, my recommendation would be if you want to, you could just leave it in this mode where it's slides and people, and then you can assign a student in your class to help you. And what that's going to do is mean that student could have the little circle box, and that little person could switch back and forth modes for you to kind of help you out, so you don't have to manage that. And he or she could also point out if somebody on the screen has a question and is raising their hand. So this way you don't have to kind of look back over and over and over again, but you're letting that student manage it. So just to kind of summarize the tips on this is arrive to your class as early as you can, which also means that if you're teaching, when you're done, make sure that you get out of the class as fast as you can, and you encourage your students to get out. And normally we all just treasure those moments when we get to have the students come up to you after class, and those are the best times, right? Talking to them. This semester we want to try to move those out of the class and either do those in office hours or just do those in the hallway or outside. So you need to make sure that the next class can get in and make sure there's enough time. So if you don't have a class after you, that's great. But if you do, make sure that the other professors can arrive early. So for you, arrive early so you can set up, test all this stuff, and be ready to go. And then just know the first week and maybe even the second and third week, there might be some issues. And the more you and I can model being gracious and not freaking out, then the more our students won't freak out. Our students can be like our kids, where if we get stressed, they get stressed. So the more we can kind of hold ours, then they'll be okay too. So just know there may be a little bit of failure, and that's going to be okay. But again, if you assign a student to help you out, show them how it works, show them the instruction thing, make sure that you're able to not have to manage as much of that. That can be really, really great. And then if you can break up the time and just be thinking about at least one or two switches, that'll help the distance students, it'll help the inside students, it'll help everybody to be engaged in your class. And I know based on the class type, that's not always possible. Some classes just are going to need a lot of lecture, and some are going to need a lot of discussion. You can't always vary it in the same way. But if you can find ways to do that, that'll be really strong. So that'll be that first 11 weeks of the class. And then after Thanksgiving, we're going to transition to teaching laptop to laptop. So we're going to use Zoom or Webex, and we're going to see the Hollywood squares of people on screen. So there's a couple ways you can do this, and you've all experienced this in the spring and the summer. But one way would just be to move totally to the video conference, where you just take the time that you have. If that's 2 75-minute periods or one 3-hour period, you can just move it right on there. And that can be really great in a lot of cases, depending on the kind of class that you have and the goals and objectives you have. But for a lot of classes, it may be better for you to make some pre-recorded videos, kind of like I'm doing now on loom.com, or I'm using Camtasia here. You can create a video with some content that you really want that student to be able to, say, refer back to. Say if it's kind of like a review for a final and you want them to be able to go back over it a couple of times, then creating a video like I'm doing now can be really helpful. And then you can tell your students, hey, instead of us meeting for a full 3 hours on Zoom with a break in between, you can just meet for 75 minutes because you've given them 75 minutes of lecture. It doesn't have to be exactly 75 minutes. It could be 2 20-minute videos or 5 10-minute videos. Any of those combinations would work great as long as you just communicate it to your students. And then for your students themselves, you could have them present online. Sometimes that can work out actually okay, but sometimes students have failures on that too. So teaching them and spending some time early in the semester showing them how to record with their laptop and then storing that file in something like OneDrive or Dropbox. And then instead of trying to upload that file to Canvas, just have them give you a link that you can click on and go watch their video. That way, the file transfer is as easy as possible. So again, our online ed team can really help you manage that and build that assignment if you want to go that route. So if you're doing a preaching or a missions class or an education class where you need that final presentation, even an ST class that does that, this can be the model to go. So just to keep in mind a couple of things about video conferencing, it can be really great for an online lecture where you're just going to teach through some slides, but it can be a little bit harder if it's too long. Students can lose attention. And it's hard for you to see them while you're seeing your slides and while you're doing all those things. You don't get that kind of facial feedback and body language of if they're getting it. So I would say if you're going to do this, to kind of keep that shorter. And then if it's going to be really long, then maybe do some pre-recording and use the classroom time for discussion so that you can actually think through the material or something that you had them read. And depending on how long that discussion is going to be, you may need to think about breaking them into smaller groups or having a plan for discussion and having different groups talk about different things if your class is really, really large. This can also be, like I said, a good time for a student to give a brief presentation, to walk through something. That can be really fun. And also this semester, both before and after Thanksgiving, you can use all this technology to bring in guest speakers that you wouldn't normally have. So this can be a fun time to be able to use that and to be able to use the technology to bring in people that you couldn't normally get to come to your Dallas or Houston classroom. And finally, to remember that there is the chat features when you're using Zoom and Webex or Teams or LifeSize. If you're using those things after Thanksgiving, if you can tell the students, hey, while I'm talking, if you have a question, go put it over there in the chat. And when I pause, I'll go look at the chat and try to answer some of those questions. And that way someone doesn't have to keep their hand up the whole time and try to remember what their question was. They can just type it in there. And sometimes students can actually dialogue while you're talking too. So if you can encourage them to take advantage of the chat and then make sure that you're periodically checking that, that can add kind of a rich layer of interaction. And then just to keep in mind the struggles that we all have experienced so well in this season, that it's hard when you don't have embodiment, it's harder to connect. Hopefully you'll have had 11 weeks of in-person interaction to connect with them so that those last 2 weeks can be really rich, but that's hard. And just know we're all going to be struggling with attention. The end of the semester, it's going to be tough. So again, when you're varying, that will help them. And to know that if you are going to have a discussion, that we've all learned that early on we forgot to mute our mics. Now we've all have our mics muted and we forget to unmute when we want to talk. So there's going to be little delays, and that's just going to be kind of part of what we have to do. And then just knowing that eye contact that you don't have makes it hard, and everyone feels like they're on stage, so that can be a real challenge. But if you can overcome these things and just kind of work through them and plan ahead, I think you'll have a great semester and your students will really appreciate it. So a couple of final tips. Whatever it is that you do, just make sure that you communicate with your class. They're never going to be frustrated that they got too many emails from you, but they are going to be frustrated if they don't hear enough from you. So that's number one. And then number two, again, remember, once you've moved to online and you're using Zoom or Webex or something like that, to use the chat feature, just because that will allow them to interact, and make sure that you're checking that as you go. And then just plan for some kind of failure. Just set those expectations low. Know it's going to be a little bit rough, but guide your students through it and show them, hey, if I can do it, anybody can do it. I would say on number 4, the more you've planned ahead for how you're going to use that time, the better it's going to go, both in class and out of class. And then again, to remember to vary the content if at all possible. If you can do something interesting and different on there, I think they'll all appreciate that. So all of the stuff is on students.dts.edu/online courses. If you want some help with overall online pedagogy or how to do video conferencing or how to record a lecture, all those things are going to be on that site, so you can get it there. And our final just thing to remind us is that all the technology in the world can't make faculty good, but we have amazing faculty, and the more time that you're going to be able to spend with your students, just loving on them and being patient with them, they're going to appreciate that, and that's what they're going to remember even more than their material. So the material, of course, is important. God's word is important, but I think the way that we treat them is ultimately going to be the thing that they most remember. So thank you for all you're doing, and I appreciate all that you're going to do this fall to make it a great semester for our students.